All right, good evening. I'm Liz Smith, the event director at Axpona, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's webinar, Networking for Audiophiles, presented by Andrew Gillis of Small Green Computer. So I have a few housekeeping notes. Tonight's webinar will last about an hour. Andrew is going to start with a short presentation and then take some questions. If you have a question that you think of while you're watching the presentation or as things go on, please submit your questions via the question feature. We also received so many questions in advance, so we're going to do our best, or Andrew's going to do his best to answer as many as possible while we go through tonight. So now a little bit about Andrew. Andrew is the owner and CEO of Small Green Computer. He has been in the audio business for more than 20 years and got his start in the voiceover IP market. Andrew has been building and selling music servers for more than a decade. Some of his accomplishments over his career include the introduction of the first music servers for Squeezebox and developing the first Roon-ready network player streamer. His company, Small Green Computer, is dedicated to utilizing the latest technology to bring your entire music collection to life. Andrew, thank you so much for being here tonight. Are you ready to get started?
Yeah, I am. Thanks, Liz. So yeah, here we'll just go right into our first slide. So I get a lot of questions about networking. When you start, creating a digital source, you're going to be using a network in your house, and so that's one of the biggest things that people have to start with. They're like, hey, I had this audio system, it was all just analog wires, and now I have to have a network. Like, how do I do that? So that's what we're going to try and go over tonight. So I'm going to start with how this all started. Of course, nobody had digital sources to begin with. We had turntables. We had live music. I mean, right? Like if you go back far enough, and then all of a sudden in the 80s we had the CD player, and that was a revolution. It allowed music to be stored in a digital format, just ones and zeros, not in an analog format, which is like voltage. And so that's how we kind of started this whole process. So in the early 90s, they came up with this protocol called SPDIF, which allows digital music to go over optical fiber into your DAC. And so that was kind of the first time that we actually sent digital stuff out from what we would call now a server or a player, or something like that. And you could put a CD in and play it. So that's how we got that. So that's the very first digital source. So now, fast forward to the late 90s, people are like, hey, I have 1,000 CDs. They're all over my wall. I lose them. They get scratched. I have one in my car that I wish I had in my house. How can I get these things all in one place and be able to to listen to them more effectively? So by that point, people had laptop computers with CD drives, or sometimes desktop computers. Laptops are actually probably pretty rare in the early 90s. And you could put a CD in and convert it to MP3 files. Now, this was the very beginning of this whole thing. CDs, particularly in 90s standards, hold a huge amount of data. They were about 600 megabytes worth of data. And so back then, you were lucky if you had like a 2 or 3 gigabyte hard drive. And so if you stored a couple CDs, your hard drive would get full. So they had to come up with some way to compress the data. So the very first way to do that was MP3s. This is true compression. It's actually taking some of the sound out. It's lossy compression. You're losing data, but at the end of the day, it still sounds okay, particularly if you play it through through headphones or a small little media player or something like that. But then the next step that happened was we invented these USB DACs. So the DAC is very much like what used to be in a CD player. In a CD player, they take the bits off a spinning disk, they run them through a digital analog converter, that's what DAC stands for, make it into analog, send it out the back, and then it goes into your amplifier. Well, so now you have a way to send music from your computer over USB to the DAC, and then into that same stereo system through an analog input on your amplifier. And all of a sudden, people started to get good DACs, and they were like, wow, these MP3s sound terrible. So they started to go back and rip their CDs into, lossless formats like FLAC and ALAC and some of these other things. But this whole process here has one or a couple of flaws. One is this USB cable and the fact that you have to kind of sit by your audio system with a computer. It's not like the old days where you put a CD in and then you could sit in your easy chair. You kind of had to keep going back to the computer to control it, and so it wasn't really a very good solution. What you need is something that's easier to control, more like with a remote or something, and to kind of get this this laptop out of here. Yeah. So the next sort of iteration of all this was streaming services. They started to come in, Spotify, Pandora, and the idea of these things is they have an unlimited music collection, and they can send it in through your internet router, and you can pick it up on something like a tablet with some kind of little app, and then maybe you send it over to some wireless speakers. Maybe your sound system has AirPlay or Bluetooth or one of these types of wireless things, and you can get all these playlists. You can get this unlimited amount of music. You can have these tailor-made radio stations. It really kind of opened the world to a lot more music being available. The problem is it looped us back to the MP3s again. The stuff coming in on these streams was pretty low quality. And then if you look at this, it's got to come into your router, it's got to go Wi-Fi, it's got to go into your tablet, then it's got to go either Wi-Fi again or Bluetooth over to your speakers. There's a lot of places here for this music to get, for packets to get dropped, for corruption, for little pops and clicks in the music. If this was a phone and not a tablet, a call comes in and now all of a sudden you got little beeps coming out of your speaker because you got an incoming call. It was kind of a mess, but there's actually still a lot of people who do this today, and this is kind of where we are now for a lot of people is this very wireless thing. The other problem with this is now what happened to that CD collection you had. Maybe you had some obscure artists, some people you really like that maybe they only released a few CDs. You can't find that stuff on streaming, so you kind of lost connection with your local media. So that was the problem with this. So now we start to get to the final solution, which is being able to have all of your music, from streaming, all of your local music, all your CDs, all in a sort of an easy to use, setup. But there's a bunch of parts to this, and so we're going to go over each one in order here, and kind of some ideas of what makes each one of these things better. So the very first thing we're going to start with is a router. So these routers have been around for years. There's various kinds of internet you can get. You can get, Comcast from a cable company. You can get, Verizon Wireless will give you something. You can have these DSL systems from a phone system, but they all have one thing in common. Some kind of wire comes into your house, and then it goes into this router. This thing is pretty important. It's most of the time it's doing your Wi-Fi connection for your house as well, and then it's also transferring packets from the internet into your home. You want a good router. A lot of internet providers give you one. Usually they're pretty good, but make sure you have the latest one. Make sure you don't have got some Comcast service like 10 years ago and they haven't bothered to give you a new router. Call them up, get a new one, because routers are released every year. They're faster. They have lower latency. They have, software that updates. I remember back in the old days, people get their routers hacked because they had some old firmware on them. Now they update all the time for security. So that's important. One thing that's not super important though is the bandwidth. These companies are all in this sort of arms race to give you the best quality or the fastest speeds. 100 meg, a gig. I mean, man, if you've got like 10 meg service, you can probably stream some pretty high resolution audio. So if that's all you're into, and you're doing this whole thing for audio, which is why a lot of people are here, you don't need a super fast connection. You just need a good connection from a reliable provider. Fiber optic is best if you have that. Cable modems are pretty good. DSL can be not that great, but sometimes you don't have a choice. Whatever you can get in your area. The next thing we're going to talk about is an Ethernet switch. So for some people, maybe the only experience you've had with these things is through wireless. You know, you have a router, you've got a tablet, you've got a laptop that's wireless, and you haven't really worked a lot with this hard networking, which is what we call Ethernet. So there's these these cables, and again, there's people with pretty widely ranging levels in this talk. I'm not going to go into this too deep, because if you're a complete novice to this, you should Google Ethernet and start to learn about some of this stuff. But we have wires and we have this Ethernet switch, and this is really the core of your wired home network, not your wireless network, your wired network. A lot of routers have Ethernet switches built into them. Most of them, if you look on the back, they got 4 ports on the back. I don't recommend using them. Some of them are slow. Some of them are trying to do some kind of weird firewalls in between the ports. I've seen a lot of problems that people have had using the switch that's inside their router. So you can buy a good Ethernet switch for 20 bucks. Go buy one. Run a wire from your router to it. This is going to be the center of everything you're doing, and it's important to have have a good piece here. The next piece I've got on here is a music server. You can use a computer for this, like a Mac Mini or a Windows desktop or even a laptop. In most cases, you're going to get better sound if you have a dedicated machine, and the reason for that is you don't have anything else that this thing is doing. Your average computer, it's running antivirus software, it's browsing the internet, it's doing 35 things at once, and so it has a lot of latency, and when it tries to feed music out, it can be a little slow, and that can impact the sound. So dedicated music server, hardwired. Again, everything I show you in this is going to be hardwired. You want the path that the music is going from your computer to your DAC, or from where it's stored to your DAC, to be hardwired. So I'm gonna say that again, because that's a pretty important part of this whole networking for Audiophiles thing. You can use wireless for control, for picking what track is going to play next, for connecting, showing how to connect to Tidal or to one of these streaming services, but the actual path that the audio is traveling should be all wired. I think you can run it over wireless, but the chance of you getting like dropouts and problems is pretty high. So now we're going to go to the next piece here. So this is a music streamer. So what this thing does is it receives the audio packets, and it converts them, again, still in digital, to some kind of protocol that can go to your DAC, usually USB, sometimes SPDIF. There's a couple other different ones. I'm going to show it with USB, because this is the same USB DAC we used in the last slide. And again, you're replacing your computer here. Like, a very common thing that people had before was a laptop plugged into a DAC. We've now kind of replaced it with all this other stuff, and this is a lot of what's helping you get better sound. You can see over here we get the analog coming out of the DAC. It's going back into this system. We're kind of working for this, and we're kind of showing the evolution of this. So I'm gonna go back through all these pieces here again, now that I've kind of exposed them all. So in this music server that I have here probably has your music collection on it. So if you've ripped CDs, you have FLAC files, you've bought high-res files online, all these types of like music files that you already have, they can be stored internally on a hard drive in this server here. And so this is like, it's kind of like a one-to-many relationship. You have one server and many players. You could be playing to an Apple TV, you could be playing to a Sonos ceiling speaker or something like that, but this is like the center of your network. And so then we go over here to the Ethernet, and then we go to this streamer, which is converting the music packets from what goes over your network to this USB cable, still digital, and then it's going into the DAC, getting converted to analog, and going into your player. And so by doing it all this way, you're getting some isolation, right, over this network. Each one of these network cables is galvanically isolated. It means that there's actually a little air gap, a little transformer inside here. And so like noise that's being created in the server, or noise that's being created in this router over here, is having trouble getting into the streamer. And then, by the time this thing cleans it up, goes down USB to the DAC, you're not getting a lot of analog noise into the DAC. Now, it's important here to get the difference between analog noise and digital noise. So on the Ethernet here, it's all ones and zeros. It's packets of data, packets of sound, and they're digital, and so they're not really affected by noise. They leave the music server, they get into the streamer. You're not going to lose any ones and zeros. But what you don't want is to get noise on these wires. They're just wires. They're like any other wires. They can pick up analog noise, and you don't want to get them into your DAC, because then when it gets converted to analog, that analog noise can make it into your system, and you hear it. So now the one more piece that we're going to show on here is this. This is the tablet, and this is what you control. So this, if you want to pick a new track, if you want to like switch from your local source to title coming in off the internet, this is kind of your user interface. Like in the old days, people maybe have like a 5-channel CD player, right? And they've got a remote control and they can pick which CD plays. That's what this thing is doing. And this is actually Wi-Fi. This is going over here. That's no problem, because even if you throw this thing out the window, the system's going to keep playing, because all the music is traveling over the hardwired network. This is just the remote. So if you got streaming, it's hardwired, it's coming in from the internet. If you got local source, it's hardwired, it's coming in over here, but it's all just going over your network. So let's see if there's anything else here that we're missing. I think that's pretty good. Oh yeah. So someone just asked about latency and what that is. I think I might have used that word a few times. So latency is like the amount of time that it takes the stuff to come from the music server and go over the network. And that's latency. If it's variable, then you start getting jitter. The packets don't show up on time. Then you can get dropouts. Again, this music is being sent over tiny packets, and if a few of them get dropped, you hear that as an actual click in your music. So it's important to have a very low latency network and have a very reliable network. Again, that's why we're not using Wi-Fi for any of this stuff. Wi-Fi, it's like, your dryer kicks on and there's a bunch of electrical noise in the air, electrical storm, your neighbor has a new Wi-Fi router that's transmitting on the same power as yours. It's very easy for Wi-Fi to work sometimes. It's very hard for it to work perfectly all the time for audio. And that's why we just, if you stick with the wired, it's better. So that's a good one there. Again, this whole idea of having a server and a player, I think that makes a huge difference, because you can have upsampling, a lot of different kinds of heavy processing stuff, indexing the music, hard drives. Sometimes even your hard drive is spinning, so it's got a motor in it, it's noisy. All that stuff can be over here, and then the player can be very, very clean, can be filled with linear power supplies, very precise clocks, so that by the time the music gets to the DAC, it's very, very pristine, and it's very free of analog noise. So when it goes into your amplifier, it sounds really good. So this is kind of where we are today. Like this is some of the best ways to get sound out of your network. A lot of what people are talking about now is using optical Ethernet instead of wired Ethernet. So I'm going to go into that next here. So it's pretty interesting. In my very first slide, I showed sending music over a SPDIF cable, which, I mean, they were doing this in the early 90s. They picked that glass SPDIF cable because it couldn't transmit any noise. Now, unfortunately, back then, the transmitters and receivers they had weren't that good. They had kind of a lot of jitter on them. So SPDIF itself is an okay way to transmit music. USB is probably better now, but it didn't have any noise on it. So that part was a good, engineering accomplishment. So the question is, can we do that now with this Ethernet setup? And we can. Fortunately, for us, engineers designed sending Ethernet over optical fiber. It was supposed to be for long distances, like over a kilometer, right, between buildings, even across country. We're actually using it for very short distances for something completely different than what it was designed for, which is the fact that you can transmit packets without transmitting any of the analog noise. So here we're going to start with the same setup we had on the last screen. We got the router, we got the Ethernet switch, we got the music server. These are all connected with the same wired Ethernet. And yeah, some people ask me like what kind of wires to use, right? Do you use a $10 one that you buy on Amazon? Do you use a $1,000 one that they sell on some audio specialty store? If you have the previous slide where you're sending Ethernet all the way up to the player, yeah, if you use a shielded Ethernet cable or good quality Ethernet cables, you're going to cut down on your noise. And that's where we kind of started all this, right? Like, well, should you buy $1,000 Ethernet cable for every cable in your system? And maybe it's going to improve the sound a little bit, but it's going to cost you kind of a lot. But really, where do you care about eliminating the noise? You don't care as much on the router and the switch. You care about the noise getting into your DAC. So what if you used fiber and went into your player? Just the last leg. That's kind of the key to where you want to put it, because now you have these Ethernet packets. They're coming over this converter. Just takes the same packets and it converts them from wired Ethernet to fiber Ethernet, which is just light. It's going over optical fiber, and optical fiber can't transmit noise. It's not metal. It can't pick up noise like a radio antenna. If you wrap it around a noisy source, a transformer, fluorescent light, you can't induce noise into it. It's really good at eliminating noise, and so we're kind of using it as a transmission medium, but also as a filter. In this case, we have our optical Rendu, which has an optical Ethernet port. There aren't that many network players out there that have optical ports, but there's various little types of converters you can put over here and things like that. So that goes into the same thing, into the USB DAC. Again, now this is super clean because you got the digital in here without getting any of the analog noise along with it. So you've got a really clean signal. You can send it into your DAC, and when this goes into your amp, you're going to get a really low noise floor, that very dark, clean, almost like three-dimensional sound. It works really well, and you're not going to get any dropouts. You want use some really high bit rates, DSD 512 or something like that. This very low latency, very fast network has no problems handling that. So this is, I think this is kind of the epitome of the of the system. This is kind of where we are today, the cutting edge of using basically a computer network to send audio to a system, basically replacing this CD player with all of this other stuff. Now, this may look kind of complicated. You got a lot of parts here, but most of these parts you have in your house anyways, right? The router, the Ethernet switch, you kind of need that stuff anyways. The server. Another thing people ask me is placement on all these things. They're like, okay, Andrew, I've got all these boxes here. Where do they all go? Well, the analog cable from the DAC to your amp should be as short as possible. So the DAC should go very near the amp. This USB cable should be as short as possible. So that should go right there. The network streamer Yeah, just throw it right on top of the DAC, a little short USB cable. All of these things should be plugged into power conditioners if you got them. I mean, these three components, the networks thing, the DAC, the amplifier, are all very sensitive to noise. You want to, feed them as cleanly as possible. But then you got this optical fiber. This thing can be as long as you want, by the way. Like Ethernet cables, the longer they are, the more noise they pick up. Fiber cable, 5 feet to 500 feet, 1,000 feet, nothing, no noise on it, no matter what. So some people run this between floors. It's kind of a pain. I mean, right, if you don't have fiber optics running in your house, who has that? Maybe you could run it, drill a hole in the floor or something. Really, as long as you just run it 3 feet, maybe run it into the media converter right there, and then run a long fiber optic. The Ethernet switch and the music server and the router, they can be anywhere. When your internet provider came to your house, they probably put your router in a specific room, put the rest of the stuff next to it, put the Ethernet switch there, put the music server there. You don't need any of these kind of noisy things in your listening room, and you actually don't even really want them there, and you definitely don't want them plugged into the same power outlet or the same power conditioner as all this stuff, because that's really where the magic is happening, is on this optical fiber. I kind of call this the clean end, and then I call the media converter the dirty end. I mean, this is the noisy stuff over here, and this is the clean stuff over here. So that's kind of my thing on placement. So what's our next slide? Oh yeah, and then this control over here. Yeah, this Wi-Fi thing is actually giving off some noise, but you're sitting back in your easy chair listening to music. So this Wi-Fi source is not too close to your amp and your speakers. It shouldn't be too bad. This router, at least the way I've just described, is in another room, so that's going to be fine. And then hey, everything's hardwired, so it's going to sound pretty good. The next couple slides here I have are some of the most common questions. I'm going to open this up to Q&A eventually, but these are questions I get every week from people. And the number one question is, I have my listening room on the 3rd floor and my router's in the basement. What do I do? Like, do I have to get an electrician? Do I have to drill holes in all the walls and run this Ethernet? Do I have to run fiber between floors? Like what do I do? And so fortunately, there's this really cool technology that's been around for a while called HomePlug. And so what that does is it sends Ethernet over the electrical wiring in your house. So you just buy these little adapters. And by the way, like a pair of these things is like $20. They're like super cheap. And it's basically sending the Ethernet, from your switch into this thing. And you just plug this into any outlet in your house. And then you get the other one and you plug that in anywhere else. And it's literally like you have an Ethernet cable connecting the two. This is neat stuff. And it's funny, people have never heard of this. They sell thousands of these every year. You can buy them on Amazon. They're really easy to get, but it's a very unknown technology, even though it's been around for 20 years, and it works really, really well. In some cases, you could throw another Ethernet switch here on the other floor if you wanted. Yeah, you got your network streamer here, but what if you've got a TV or a set-top box or even a computer or something else you need to plug in up here? That's fine. This is just like a wire, so you can kind of put things wherever you want, right? You could put the music server on this side if you want. You put it on this side. You can have an Ethernet switch here. What does it do for noise? Yeah, the electrical wires are noisy, but this thing, this Ethernet is galvanically isolated, so this isn't really any noisier or less noisy than an Ethernet cable. Again, the next solution would probably be to use some optical isolation here in case you did get any noise from that. You could clear that out before you went into your streamer. But this is really key. Very simple. Takes about 10 minutes to set up, and you don't have to go drilling holes into your house to get your hardwired Ethernet onto another floor. So yeah, HomePlug, great. Just go on Amazon, type in HomePlug, Google HomePlug. You can find out all kinds of stuff about how this works. The next one that a lot of people ask me about is mesh networks. So these are becoming really, really popular. In the old days, you had your router, and it was sitting in your basement or in your living room or wherever the phone company put it. And so you got great Wi-Fi in that room, but then in the other end of the house, you have terrible Wi-Fi because Wi-Fi can only go so far. It'll get blocked by walls, etc. And so then we had these kind of Wi-Fi extenders that you could plug around, or multiple access points, and all those created lots of problems. They were creating multiple Wi-Fi networks in your house. Sometimes they were overlapping with each other, so they were like robbing each other of signal strength, and the whole thing ended up being really slow and not working very well. So then, now that everybody needs really fast, low latency networks for audio and for video, they came up with this mesh network thing. So these things are using a different band of Wi-Fi to transmit the data on the mesh, and then they're also reinforcing your Wi-Fi. So you end up with one Wi-Fi network. It's very fast. Anything can go from any other point at very fast speeds. The other thing that's really cool about a mesh network is they all have a little Ethernet port on them. So if you see in this picture, I've got my modem coming in here and my switch and then my server. And then over here, I've got my player plugged in, and they're not connected, even though they are both hardwired. They're both hardwired to the mesh. And these things are very complex, and they're surprisingly easy to set up. I mean, they really do try and make these things. They have some little app that sets that all up for you. The thing on these mesh networks is like almost like a best practice tip. It's pretty easy, if you don't think about it, or if you just hook these fast, or you don't read the instructions, to hook these up wrong. And it's mostly just this first one here. So this thing over here, I have this as a cable modem. Sometimes, as we explained before, these have Wi-Fi. Sometimes they have a switch in it. You don't want to use any of that. If you can, shut off the Wi-Fi network that's part of this, disable it, or just ignore it on your phone. Don't hook anything up to this part too, because see, this Ethernet comes out of the router or the cable modem, and then it goes into the mesh, and then it comes back out here. Well, so if you put things on the back side of the mesh, then things that are in the mesh can't get to it, and it creates this sort of weird thing where you can sort of partially get to things on your network, but they don't work, and it's very, very, very frustrating. So just make sure that everything is on the sort of inside of your mesh, kind of the way I have it drawn here. And these things are amazing. They're a good way to get wired Ethernet in other parts of your house. They're a good way to have a very strong Wi-Fi signal on your whole house. And for the most part, they work pretty good. Another possible way to wire this up would be to have the music server over on this end at the same place as the Rendu. In that case, your music would only be on a hard network still, which would be good. At least with this one, it's only on one wireless hop. So it's a mesh, which is supposed to be pretty strong. So it should work. That would be the only other thing you could maybe do here to improve it. But for the most part, these work pretty good. So that was a lot of information, all in, what do we do, 40 minutes, 35 minutes. But we have a lot of this information on our website. There's a lot of this stuff on our websites. A lot of these slides I've given you have kind of given you places to start to look at this stuff. And I'm always available on the Small Green Computer website. You just click contact us if you have any questions. Yeah, here's a picture of our site here. Yeah, just fill out the form and you can get to us. So let's see what you guys have for us. I got Jim here. He's going to. So the first question is a NAS a good substitute for a music server? So one of the things that I didn't go over too much in the presentation, because this is mostly for networking, is what to run for music server software. We mostly use Roon. That's ROON, if people aren't familiar with it. You can run a lot of music software on a NAS. You can use DLNA. I'm not going to go into too deep of all these different kinds of protocols, but like Roon doesn't work too well. So typically you want to run that on a computer or a dedicated Roon core server, which is what I've shown there. A NAS adds one more level of complexity to your network, but again, as long as it's hardwired, as long as it's plugged into that switch I kept showing you back at the beginning, It should work. It should work pretty well, particularly people with very, very large music collections. I definitely recommend a NAS because they do backups, they do multiple drives, mirroring, all that kind of stuff, and that's what they're good at. So the next question is about high-end or audiophile Ethernet switches. So this is a really good question. I'm going to give you guys my whole thought on Ethernet switches in general. So one of the reasons I showed you using a dedicated Ethernet switch, not the one that's in your router, is because the ones in the router are slow. They don't have good. Their latency is bad. Sometimes their packet buffers aren't big enough. But one of the traps people fall into is they buy a smart switch. So smart switches are very expensive. They're like $1,000 instead of $50. They're programmable. They're made by great networking companies like Cisco. The biggest problem with them is they're designed for enterprise level networks, and they have to be programmed by an engineer. So if you just buy one of these things off the shelf and plug it in, it's not going to be programmed correctly. The default settings on these things are terrible. And so if you buy like a $2,000 Cisco switch and you don't hire a Cisco engineer to have them program it for you, it's not going to work well for you. You're literally going to get dropouts. You're going to have problems that are worse than what you would get with a $20 switch. If you had a giant enterprise network, then that Cisco switch is going to work great, particularly if it's programmed by someone. So then we get over to the audiophile switches. They're pretty good. What they're doing is they're trying to do what we've talked about a lot here, reducing the analog noise in the network. They've got better clocks, they've got better power supplies in them sometimes. It's if you're using an all wired Ethernet network, you're definitely going to get some performance out of those. I'm still a big fan of going with optical. As long as you have that last optical leg to filter out all the noise, I don't think you necessarily needed an Ethernet switch. But if you don't, yeah, they're a good idea. They're going to give you better sound. They're going to keep latency. Again, most of the audiophile switches, fortunately, are dumb. They're not smart switches. They have very high switching speeds. So yeah, they work really well. All right, so the next question is about all of the cabling standards for Ethernet. So there's Cat 5, Cat 6, Cat 7, Cat 8. One of the main things that are the difference, you think like, oh, Cat 8 is so much better than Cat 5. It's how many times the cables are twisted. So Ethernet uses what's called a differential amplifier, which is a fancy electronic term for an amplifier that eliminates noise. And so what you want to do, the way it works is as long as the noise is induced equally on both the wires, it will be 100% eliminated. So you could have a signal level of like 1 volt that you're trying to read, and you could have noise of 100 volts. And because the noise is on both wires and the signal is only on one wire, it's very easy for the differential amplifier to get rid of all the noise. But it has to be put on the wires equally. So they twist the wires so that any noise source will be ensured to be induced into the wires equally. The higher levels, they're just more twisted. The other thing they add at the higher levels is shielding. The shielding does help because that's another way to keep noise from getting into your wires. It's going to keep analog noise off there. It does act as an antenna. In most cases, it's going to bring that noise back to ground over the shielding. The only thing that I've seen with these cables, and so Cat 5 and Cat 6 are unshielded, Cat 7 and Cat 8 are shielded. The only thing I've seen with the shielded ones is you can get ground loops. So audiophiles live in fear of these ground loops, right? And it's where you have multiple paths to ground, and you get this like buzzing in your audio system because of the different voltage levels. So Ethernet by design is supposed to be galvanically isolated on each end so that you don't get any DC current through it. When you add a ground to it, now you can get ground loops. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. The Cat 7 and Cat 8 is shielded. It's better. It's lower noise. You also have the potential of ground loops. Of course, if you go with optical fiber, you get the best of both worlds. You don't need the shielding and you don't get a ground loop. So we loop back to my last slide. Optical is the way to go. But yes, Cat 7 and Cat 8 are better than Cat 5 and Cat 6 because they have more twists and they're shielded. So a lot of companies, yeah. So the question is, why is the server and player separated? So I'm actually going to go back to the slide so you can see that one. So we'll go back all the way. Here's a good one. So there's a few reasons. One, the server does a lot of work. It does the upsampling. That's where the music's stored. If you had multiple players that sort of were all in a vacuum and they all had their own music collection, and again, I've seen people do this. They have these little players and they're like, oh, just plug a USB hard drive full of music into this thing and it'll play it. That's great unless you want one in another room. Then you have to copy all your music to that one, that hard drive, plug it in over there. So it's like a unified source, like all your streaming, all your playlists, all your files all come into like one location. That's key. Yeah, we call that the one to many. One room core, one central server, and then many players. And then the other big advantage is noise. These a music server is inherently noisy. Storage, even hard drives are very noisy. SSD storage is less, but still noisy. This networking stuff can be noisy. So by splitting it up, it's a great way to get rid of that noise. Now, they're certainly all-in-ones. Lots of times you look inside the case, they have these like big metal firewalls down the middle of the case trying to separate sort of the server piece and the player piece and still pretend to be an all-in-one. But mostly they have to do a lot of isolation inside to do that. We've just found it's easier to put it into two boxes. Plus the whole component thing, it allows you to get a new player but not have to get a new server. You can try different components without having to, get rid of the whole thing. Is there a cost-effective solution where I don't have to buy a optical Rendu? Can I get fiber into my network? So someone asked about getting fiber optics into your network without an optical Rendu. So this thing here, we started all this with these fiber Ethernet converters. These things are pretty cheap, and they were again just designed to have in a business network to go to a long haul link. You can buy them for $50 on Amazon. Even if you just run two of these back to back, they sound pretty good. I mean, that's what gave us the idea to try this. The only problem is because they're only $50, they've got a lot of switching supplies in it. So it's like, yeah, you clean off all the noise and then you kind of put a little of it back on the other side when you go back to Ethernet. So the sort of simple way to use fiber is to get two of these, run them back to back, use a very, very short Ethernet cable to go from the last one into your streamer. And again, say you got a PS Audio DAC with a streamer built into it. There's a name NDX. There's a large number of these devices that have built-in streamers and have Ethernet ports. That's an inexpensive way to isolate it. We actually sell something called an optical module, which is one of these media converters, but it has better clocks in it, better power supplies, and so you put that on the clean end, and that way you don't put noise back into the fiber. So that's kind of the three levels. So the first level is to use a couple of cheap media converters. The second level is to use a cheap media converter and a good high quality audiophile media converter. And then the third level is to have a streamer that actually has a fiber input built into it. Is there value to running optical from your switch or router to your music server? So the next question is there value to using optical in other parts of your network? Well, like a lot of things in this hobby, there's the law of diminishing returns. I'm fortunate that I have a lot of customers, and some of them are very wealthy, and they will try really cool things. And like I have this one guy who's got like 10 houses, and he tries like a different thing in each house. And so he had one house where every Ethernet connection in the entire house was fiber optic. And he says to me, he says, Andrew, this house sounds amazing. Everywhere I'm in, everything sounds good. But I'm thinking like it probably would have sounded pretty good if you just had the last leg going to your streamer be optical too. It's kind of like overkill. Yes, it'll work great if you put optical on every Ethernet connection in your house. Sure, you're going to eliminate a lot of noise, but I don't think you're going to get nearly the bang for your buck that you would get just using cheap stuff in your whole house and just using that one optical link going to your player at the end. Back to NAS, does your music server replace the NAS or work with it? So that depends a lot on what you're doing. Yeah, sorry. The question was, does your music server work with or replace your NAS? And so, there's a lot of overlap in these slides I show. For example, I always show the DAC and the music streamer being separate. You can get a DAC with a music streamer in it. I am showing the router and the Ethernet switch being separate. You can get an Ethernet switch, the router in it, and lots of times I show them separate, just so you can see what happens when they're separate. It's not necessarily worse to have them connected. A lot of NASs, particularly ones with pretty fast processors, can be used for music servers as well, particularly if you're running a protocol like DLNA, where there's no upsampling or anything being done by the music server. It's basically just feeding the music out. So yeah, if you're running DLNA, even if you're running something like Squeezebox, you can use a NAS as a music server. I like Rune. Rune is very processor intensive. It does upsampling. It has a super fast database. You want it to run on a pretty fast core. So in that case, if you have a NAS, you do want the core to be on a dedicated Rune core music server. So the question is, what happens if you were to combine all this stuff into one box? Your DAC, your preamp. I mean, there's a lot of all-in-ones coming out now that, there's things with everything, a music server, all this stuff, all in one box. And the question was, is that inherently noisy? The answer is yes. But I'll tell you that the people who made that thing probably went to a lot of trouble to try and isolate the noise from all those different sections. And typically these multiple products that are all shoved in one box are pretty expensive. And that's why, because it's hard to do that. Some of those sound pretty good. I mean, I go to these trade shows like other people do. I go in all these rooms and I listen to all these different products because I'm fascinated with what different companies do. And some of these particularly very expensive all-in-ones sound pretty good. It's too bad if you want to upgrade one piece or if something new comes out, because then you're stuck replacing the whole thing. It's just like, using a separate preamp and an amp and, and a turntable, and then you have separate amp for that. And it's like, the more pieces you have, the more complicated it is, but then the more chances you have to tune the pieces and switch them out. So that's kind of the balancing game that we all play. So to sum that up, yes, I think it is more noisy to put them all in a box, but no, that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Does the USB cable, the last piece into the DAC, serve as an antenna also? So someone asked, does the USB cable act as an antenna? So we went to all this trouble to go optical, and now we're going back to a wire. Yes, it does. And so that's why you want to use a really good USB cable. Good USB cables, they're using low oxygen copper, so they're very, very low resistance, so they're not creating a lot of noise. They're also triple shielded so that they're not picking up a lot of noise. I always say get a short USB cable. That's another advantage, I think, of this streamer. It's hard to see in this picture how big this is, but this thing is like the size of an iPhone. And so you can put it right on top of your DAC and then run like a 1/2 meter cable to the back of your DAC. That's an advantage of having, against having a giant music server somewhere where you maybe have to run a 2 or 3 meter USB cable. That thing's going to suck up a lot of noise. So yeah, maybe someday they'll have optical USB cables. I don't know. I haven't seen a few prototypes for that. I've seen a few people trying to do that. There's no standard for it yet. So for now, shortest cable, good quality cables, definitely important. So the question was about an Ethernet switch with fiber out. So the way I show all these things here, and again, we have this thing called System Optique. It's a brand name we came up with. And the reason that we came up with that is because there's a lot of stuff in fiber. Like the thing about Ethernet, there's only one connector, and there's only like I said, 4 different kinds of cables, and they're all pretty interoperable. Each one is just a little higher bandwidth and a little less noise. With fiber, it's completely different. There's like 3 or 4 different kinds of connectors. There's multi-mode fiber, there's single mode fiber, there's SFPs, there's it's kind of a mess. So we kind of just picked one that sounded pretty good and kind of standardized on it. So what we use is single mode fiber. We use this small connector, and then we use an SFP, which is this tiny little metal box that has the actual laser in it. And so they sell Ethernet switches with a bunch of wired ports and then with a couple of SFP ports. And the question is, are those any better or worse than this? I actually like that. I think it's a great idea because you're getting rid of one more box here. And getting rid of a box you don't need is always good. So yeah, if you happen to have an Ethernet switch that has an SFP slot, it's good. Just make the SFPs on both ends have to match. So like in this one, if you were putting an SFP in the streamer and putting one in the switch, make sure they're the same one, because if you get different ones, sometimes they don't talk to each other. So the question is I2S. That's getting a little bit outside of networking for audiophiles. Sometime I might do another talk on digital sources and all the different things. DACs, I'll just very quickly say DACs have a lot of different inputs, digital inputs, USB, I2S, SPDIF. Which one is better depends a lot on the DAC. Some DACs, the SPDIF's better, some the USB's better. This question was about PS Audio. On PS Audio, the I2S, yeah, it's definitely better, but I'm not going to go into that too much in this Network for Audiophiles talk. Okay, someone asked about the optical module Deluxe, which was something I mentioned real quickly early on in this. Basically, like in this picture here, I'm using this Ethernet converter, and all that does is it converts wired Ethernet to fiber. It doesn't have an IP address. It doesn't even show up on your network. It's literally just a media. It's literally what it says, a media converter. It's converting from one type of media to the other. So we make an audiophile media converter that's we use, better power supplies and better clocks. And the idea is that the Ethernet coming back out of that is cleaner. So you use that on the clean side. If you've got some kind of network streamer that you have, I mean, man, there's a ton of them, things like Lumen, things like PS Audio with a bridge built into it. I mean, Ariander, the list goes on and on. Arialic, of all of these types of things, you can use it to isolate noise from one of those. And yeah, it works pretty good. It's gonna improve your sound. Oh, this is a great question. I get asked this one all the time. So if I'm only streaming, so we're talking about Tidal and Qobuz, the reason I bring those two up is at the moment, those are the only two really good high-res ones. So this is CD quality streaming. If you're only using those, do you need a music server? That's a good question. The direct answer is no, you don't. You could use, let's go one more page down on this app. You could use your tablet to control Tidal or Qobuz. They could stream directly through to the streamer and into your DAC. It's just a little bit of a messy sort of protocol thing. Some streamers support Tidal directly, but they have their own user interface for it, so you have to use their app to control it. I'm a big fan of Rune. If you use Rune, you always need a Rune server, a Rune core. And so what they're doing is they're doing a couple things. One, if you're going to multiple endpoints, they're only bringing the stream into one place and then they're breaking it up to go to the multiple endpoints. Two, you can do stuff you can do in any other file. You can upsample, you can do digital room correction, you can apply filters. So you can do a lot of digital effects in the music server to the streaming. So yeah, so the answer to that is kind of yes and no. You get a bunch of advantages if you have a music server, but you can stream without a music server. Let's see what else we got here. Oh, so that's a good question. Power supplies. Again, we're going to go with the whole dirty side, clean side thing, and this is somewhat true too. I'm gonna talk about this optical real quick, and then I'm gonna go back to the other slide too. So like you want the good power supplies over here. So like if your DAC came with a cheap power supply, hey, maybe consider replacing it with switching. That might improve your sound. Definitely your streamer, If possible, you want to get a good supply. But then over here on these other pieces, it's not as important, because if you hook a noisy supply up to these and you get some noise in it, it's going to get filtered out. I've spent a lot of time on these optical slides. We don't want to forget that there's definitely plenty of non-optical things in the world. This link between the streamer and the thing is galvanically isolated. I mean, this thing is filtering out a lot of noise. And so same thing here, even if you're using wired Ethernet, the things that are hooked up to the DAC, you want them to be really clean. The rest of this stuff, you're going to get some improvement. Like if you put a linear supply on this Ethernet switch, you'd get an improvement, but it would be small. Because you're getting a lot of filtering with this cable here. Back on the optical side, if you put fancy power supplies on this stuff over here on the dirty side, you're probably not even going to notice, because you're pretty much getting 100% filtering out with the optical. Someone asked how you get music onto a music server. This is networking for audiophiles. It's a little bit outside the scope of this. Man, there's a lot of answers to that. Maybe you have a USB drive and you plug it in, or it's got an internal drive. You can use a NAS, as we talked about earlier. I'm probably going to have another talk on digital sources. I get a lot of questions about that in that line. So the question was about lengths of cable and fiber. Fiber doesn't matter. 5 feet, 2 kilometers, it's all the same. Most other cables are going to pick up more noise the longer they are. You're basically making an antenna. You're actually pulling noise out of the air. Electrical noise, in modern society, almost every electronic device gives off noise in the form of radio waves, and you can, or electromagnetic interference, and you can pick that up. Yeah, you just try and eliminate that where you can. A lot of good grounding on things, a lot of good, cables with shielding. But you're, again, as you get closer and closer to your output, to your DAC, that's where you want to start using better quality cables, shorter cables if possible, that kind of stuff to clean things up.
Okay, well, Andrew, I think that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you so much. Covered so much information.
Sorry. I one more question.
What?
Someone was dying to know how if any of this stuff supports video. Video is going to be big in the future. We'll have to talk about that some other time. But yes, all of this stuff will eventually support video. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. It's really nice to connect with everybody and see all of your great questions. Thank you again, Andrew. And folks, if you want to learn more, visit smallgreencomputer.com. And like Andrew said in the beginning, you can submit questions there. We're also going to be posting this recording on YouTube, so you can check that out and watch this all again. Check our website, axpona.com, for announcements on upcoming webinars, and everyone have a great night. Thank you.
Bye, guys.